Today we are welcomed by Mark Richardson from Bancor. He's going to be speaking about Bancor V3 and a little bit about just the current state of blockchain crypto right now. So Mark, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yes, hello. Thank you for everyone to showing up. So my name is Mark Richardson. I am the product architect and the head of research at Bancor. I wasn't always in cryptocurrency. I'm not technically a blockchain developer per se, so I don't have much smart contract experience. Most of the ideas that I have for how the product should operate are generally written in Python or another programming language, and then we've got a team of smart contract engineers that then translate those ideas into smart contract language. But I'm responsible for most of the design principles behind Bancor, and it keeps showing up. It's a Bancor version 3, which is something that has just recently launched. It's still a collaborative process with the rest of the Bancor team. Still a collaborative process, so I can't say that I am 100% responsible for everything that Bancor version 3 does, but everything that's underpinning it, right? So all of the major concepts, certainly all of the mathematics that govern it came entirely from me, and it was with a collaboration with the smart contract engineers that we were able to bring that to fruition.
Amazing. Do you want to just give a quick breakdown of how you got into the blockchain space and even just how you got involved with Bancor?
Yeah, certainly. So my story has been commented on as being kind of unusual. I don't actually think it is unusual, but I don't have an economics or financial background. I don't even have much of a programming background. I actually was trained as an organic chemist. So I did my Bachelor of Advanced Science at Macquarie University in Sydney. I did my PhD in organic chemistry at the University of Melbourne. I did my first postdoctoral stint at the University of California, Irvine, where I did 100% research for 2 years and then was a lecturer for the organic chemistry department there for another 2. You can look me up on ratemyprofessors.com if you like. I'm very, very proud of the work that I did there. But it was difficult being an Australian expat in the United States. I eventually decided to come back after 4 years, where I joined the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation in Australia. This is something akin to something like the National Labs. It is effectively the science agency of the Australian government. And so I had a research contract there for 3 years, beginning in 2019, which, given recent history, was kind of awkward timing. A lot of academia, especially chemistry academia, has a lot in common with something like professional athletics, in the sense that you are only as good as your last season. And I lived in Melbourne, which broke the world record for the longest contiguous lockdown. So, depending on precisely where you draw the line, Melbourne was in lockdown for 24 months. And for 14 of those months, I was not allowed to attend work. And while that's fine, the Australian government was still paying me to do nothing, which is kind of nice, but it also meant that I was not being very productive. And the next time that I was seeking employment or applying for a grant, or trying to break into academia at a university, I would have to show, right, what I'd been doing the last few years, and to say that I've done nothing at all is not a very employable strategy. And so, in the boredom and frustration and that chasm of feeling absolutely useless, I decided during 2020, after a few months, to really start focusing on ways that I can be more useful to the world, right? And a lot of what has inspired me throughout my scientific career is being useful and being of some greater purpose, something that serves the greater community. My PhD was on tuberculosis, for example, which, if you do not know, is a disease that infects 1/3 of all humans. And it is, one of the likely doomsday scenarios that we have still facing our civilization, right? Things like COVID and Ebola and all of the other pandemics that we've suffered over recent years are kind of a distraction. Things like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria are still potentially civilization-ending diseases. And so I thought that would be a good thing to study, right? And I spent a lot of time trying to elucidate how some of those compounds interact with the human immune system, with the idea to create something like at least a better vaccine or a better vaccine adjuvant, right? So that we don't have to deal with tuberculosis anymore. I think that can only be a good thing. During my work as a postdoctoral scholar, I started working on things like faster detection metrics, one of the things that the Australian government employed me to do was to figure out very fast ways to work out if a patient is infected with a drug-resistant strain of bacteria, which is another, potentially civilization-ending cataclysm that we face. So as we enter the post-antibiotics era, one of the things that we need to be very careful about is how antibiotics are used and which ones that we use to treat which diseases. And so having a censored system that allows for those things to be implemented in a very fast, very cheap, and very effective way is one of the ways that I thought that I could be of benefit to the world. And I enjoyed doing that, but because of lockdown policy, I was prohibited from continuing that work. And so the question is, what's the next best way I can be of value to the world? And what I saw in blockchain and cryptocurrency was something else that I had often struggled with, which is that I don't think that the incumbent financial institutions of the old guard can any longer be trusted with global economics. I think that it is something that is every bit as threatening as something like malaria or tuberculosis. And I think it is, we've seen things like the widening spread between the first world and the third world, and even within first world societies, the income gap is continuing to grow. And these kinds of things eventually end up in conflict and suffering, and it's a bad thing. And I wanted to spend some time thinking about how those things might be ameliorated. I started spending a lot of time looking into DeFi during lockdown, and really saw in these things called automatic market makers something that is potentially world-changing, right, and for the better. And I also saw in cryptocurrency a way that we can sort of decentralize and make more robust things like exchange systems and currency methods. One of the founding members of Bancor was a man named Bernard Lita, who was the man first responsible for the creation of the euro, uniting the EU under a single currency. But kind of paradoxically, he also noted that there are too few currencies in the world. And we are, through that concentration of centralized actors on the way that global economics works, actually building out something that is extremely sensitive. And because there are so few people that are in control of it, it might be headed for disaster. And so if DeFi and cryptocurrency is kind of a protest against that idea, then I am for that. And it's something that I thought I could spend the rest of my life working on. And I was going to do this for free, by the way. I associated myself with several different DAOs. So Kyber DAO, if anyone's familiar with the space, I was a part of that. I was also a part of the Sushi Swap movement when it got started. But after I discovered Bancor, I really thought that these were the people that had all of their ducks in a row, right? And really had their mind on the bigger picture. They weren't really paying attention to short-term narratives and hype cycles and everything else, but were still laser focused on the goal, right? Which is, the eradication, if you want to put it that way, of the influence of centralized players on global economics. And I think that Bancor is still, the biggest, the most important contender, standing, in the way of those things continuing. And that's where I got started. I began writing a bunch of different posts. I began participating in discussions within our community channels, and sort of got the attention of the Bancor founders. So in October of 2020, I began contributing as just a DAO member, and then by December, I was in regular meetings with the Bancor founders about how our product can be improved, how our messaging can be improved. And by January of 2021, the Bancor Foundation, which is a Swiss nonprofit, reached out to me with a full-time employment contract to head up research at Bancor, and I left my job in science 2 weeks later, and I've been working every single day without break for the last 18 months to help Bancor realize that mission.
That's amazing. So your core values of application technology is very interesting. Do you want to just go into the core values?
So can you please repeat the question? I wasn't able to hear the first part.
So your core values of DeFi and blockchain is very interesting. Could you just expand on that?
Yeah, so the core values of DeFi and of blockchain are that it is generally a bad idea for any one institution or any small group of people to ever have a lot of power. And in markets like anything else, it's the same thing, right? So we can refer to, political paradigms whenever influence or, in the case of markets, in case of capital, whenever this ends up concentrated in one place, generally the ability, the agency of those people to enact their will on everyone else, and it's generally without everyone else's consent, becomes, profound. It becomes convenient. And a lot of, market makers, private market makers in the world, have this same shortcoming. And it's not necessarily that they're bad people, right? I don't want anyone who in the audience to think that I'm espousing that, the traditional markets and the people that are in control of them are evil, right? Or that they are malicious. Some of them are, but on the whole, they're not. What they are, though, are in defense of their own interests, okay? And we shouldn't necessarily blame them for that. If you have a huge amount of capital or been entrusted with a huge amount of capital, let's say that you work for a bank, right, or for a centralized exchange, you do have a lot of responsibility. And often that responsibility is to defend the people that have entrusted you with funds. And sometimes that means that other participants in the market that you aren't responsible for need to be sacrificed, or at least that's how these market makers think. And I think that this is a very toxic paradigm. I think that there is a more general way that we can treat market making or the existence of markets as being in defense of everyone's interests. And what is interesting about that is that there's actually no sound economic argument against it. It's just that no one has ever figured out how to bring that vision through to fruition.
So 2 examples of people not being sort of trustworthy, the GameStop front running and also the nickel
short,
which has happened recently.
Yeah. So unfortunately or fortunately, we have no shortage of examples from recent history as to why things like Bancor are necessary or things like AMMs are necessary. So the 2 examples that you brought up, there's things like the GameStop stock phenomenon. Just quickly, right, who here is a member of the Wall Street Bets Reddit thread? Don't be shy. Who bought GME because someone posted on Reddit that the market had shorted more than 125 times more stock than there is, right? Or so I don't remember the actual number, but it's something stupid like that. And what they realized is that if only a small number of people start buying GME stock, then the people that have shorted it are going to have to start buying it back at an accelerating rate, and that wave of liquidations is going to cause the GME stock to rise in price very quickly. And in a fair market, that's fine, right? The people that have shorted GME to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, just let them fail, right? If they made a mistake, that should be on their head. And it's problematic in a sense because, like I said before, these people are responsible for other people's savings, for example, like that, and there should be someone held to account. But I do think that they should be allowed to make mistakes. And in this case, does anyone remember what centralized exchanges decided to do once they realized what Reddit was up to? They froze it. They basically said that the people that have shorted GME are not allowed to fail, right? There is too much at stake. These players are too big to fail, right? This is the same argument that we heard about banks during the 2008 financial crisis, and that philosophy of someone is always going to bail them out has to end, because they are living essentially in a world without consequences. And when you live in that world, right, when you really start to believe that you are invulnerable, you start to do really stupid shit, right? The most recent one was the nickel short. So a Chinese investment firm worth many billions of dollars decided to short nickel, and it shorted it for more nickel than the world can currently produce. And so what happened was when that short failed, they were then on the hook to deliver more nickel than you can currently extract out of the Earth's crust. And that doesn't really make any sense, right? If that is not the most elegant, demonstration for how the traditional financial markets have really stopped making sense a long time ago, then I don't know what it is. But again, what was the result, right? What happened? Rather than hold them to account, they instead decided to erase a whole day of trading. They basically, let's just pretend that that never happened. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that that's a bad thing, right? It could have led to a global financial recession just because this one, Chinese investor fat-fingered a transaction that never should have happened. But the problem is that what about the small guy that did that transaction, right? What if you decided to short nickel and lost your bet? Would the exchange come to your aid and say, that's okay, let's just forget about it? It's a problem. Because the more money you have, the more influence you have over the markets, the more the markets come to your aid when you've lost a bet, pretend that it never happened. But if you win that bet, it's fine, you get to keep all of your money. And that means that the more money that you have, it makes it basically impossible for you to lose. Now, if you are not allowed to lose a bet, that means that some other person on the other end of that transaction is losing. And it's kind of difficult to put your finger on because it's very spread out, it's very dilute, it can be very difficult to discern. But in general, it's the world economy that pays for it. And this is where the ever-increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of people that are, by law, told that they can't fail, I think starts to become an issue. And I think that more and more the world is warming up to it. They're realizing that this is happening, right? And it's not enough just to acknowledge that the problem exists, right? You can whinge and complain all you want, but it's going to be very, very difficult to topple a system that is being built, right, for thousands of years, right? This thing is thoroughly entrenched in the way that global economics works. And that's what I see in DeFi, right? It is the opportunity to build something from scratch where those kinds of process problems are permanently removed from the system. And so things like GME and the nickel short would not have happened in DeFi.
There are some research being done to sort of mitigate that whole side, flashbots and MEV. Do you know anything about it?
Like MEV, yeah. So it's not the case that so MEV, for people in the room who are unaware, MEV stands for minor extractable value. And it has to do with the fact that when you process a transaction on Ethereum, it's more like a request, right? It's a request to perform a transaction. It goes into something called a mempool, and the miners of the Ethereum blockchain sequester from that mempool the types of transactions that they are happy to process for you. And that affords them an interesting opportunity because they might have, for example, their own transactions that they would also like to process and mine in their own block. And so if you're a miner and you see that someone is about to, for example, buy $1 million of Ethereum, that's going to push the price of Ethereum up at least a little bit. And so one of the things that you might do is put your transaction ahead of theirs and buy Ethereum before they do. And that means that you get to buy Ethereum at a discount, wait for them to push the price up, and then sell your Ethereum at a premium. This is called a sandwich attack, and it happens all the time on AMMs. And so that kind of minor extractable value is certainly a problem, but it's not unique to blockchain. And I'm sick of people pretending like this is some intrinsic weakness that Ethereum or Avalanche or FTM or something has, because front running and that kind of sandwich attack is the entire business that Robinhood has built for itself. So who here uses Robinhood? Does anyone? Great, okay. So you know when you've got a Chainlink audience when no one's making stupid mistakes. So in Robinhood, every time you purchase a stock, Robinhood itself front runs you. They actually will buy the same stock ahead of you and then sell it after that you've completed your transaction. So it's like front running as a service, literal market manipulation, or basically throwing their own users under the bus in order to turn a profit. And again, I think that's disgusting. So it's not exclusive to Ethereum, these kinds of practices, just on Ethereum we call it MEV. Things like flashbots, which is what you asked about, is a private mempool. And so what this is like instead of just throwing your transaction into the generic Ethereum mempool where anyone can see it and reorganize their block in any way that they want, instead put it in this mempool and it's hidden from view, right? And that means that the miners don't know what transactions they're processing before they're executed. And this has the advantage of protecting users from revealing the actions that they plan to take. And that makes for a much more stable equilibrium in the markets where people aren't being sort of ripped off constantly.
It's crazy that it's accepted in society that this is a normal thing that the institutions and banks do. I know that DeFi happens in DeFi, but it's being worked on, and people are sort of trying to make a change to that, but it's crazy that banks and institutions are sort of allowed to do that.
I liken it to something like Stockholm Syndrome. Right? When something is just the status quo for so long, you don't even think that there might be an alternative, right? That if you just kind of are born into that world where everyone just accepts that there is an elite class and they're allowed to exploit the rest of us. Eventually, it doesn't even occur to you that that might not be true or shouldn't be true. But I think it was, Bitcoin was the beginning of trying to think about a different financial paradigm where those kinds of advantages aren't necessarily afforded automatically to the people that are born into that level of privilege. And I think DeFi is just the logical continuation of that.
Amazing. Let's jump into Bancor, V3.
Where should we start?
Let's give a little rundown of what's changed on V3. No, in fact, let's start from what Bancor is, and then jump from that to the V2 to V3 changes.
Yeah, so what is Bancor is a really interesting question, because I don't think that even some of our own committed community members fully understand it. Bancor predates Ethereum, right? It wasn't always just a system of smart contracts designed to do the things that I've been speaking about, but it actually started with community currency projects. So this is the idea that, again, from espoused by Bernard Lieta, that in some cases you don't really need a US dollar, or you don't really need a euro. You don't really need, an Australian dollar. And one of the ways that you can experiment with this is to find a localized community, generally people that are participating mostly in things like labor swaps, and issue them their own currency and say, just try this. Instead of paying each other in US dollars, pay each other in this currency instead, and let's see where it goes. And there are some very low-hanging fruits where these kinds of experiments made a lot of intuitive sense. Things like Kenya, where the government-issued fiat has completely fallen over and doesn't make any intrinsic sense anymore. But we also trialed it in thriving economies, right? I think that there are some places in North America where we also tried this, where the government-issued fiat is perfectly fine, although there are some arguments against that as well. And what we found was, first of all, these community currencies work extremely well. But they only work for certain things. So for example, let's imagine that someone wants to have their hair cut. It makes sense to pay your hairdresser with a community currency, and then for that community currency to be used for a babysitting service by someone else. And so you can develop these circular economies where value is transacted in much the same way that it would be with US dollars, but without the need for government backing or government issuance. The problem is that these economies eventually fall over when you need to interface that closed economy with economies outside of itself. So for example, imagine trying to buy gasoline, right, with a community currency, or trying to buy a gold bar, or going overseas and then trying to get the Forex broker to exchange your community currency for euros or whatever. So it doesn't always work. And the problem is exchange. You need a way to transmit value from one currency to another currency, and for there to be a way to discover the price of a currency. And that is what market makers are for, right? This is what, in the earliest iterations of itself, we would have essentially a type of auction where people would bid for one currency versus another one. Eventually we ended up with things like centralized order books, where people would say, I would like to exchange a certain amount of Australian dollars for a certain amount of American dollars, and this is the rate that I'm expecting. And the market maker will say, fine, I'll add you to the list. And if we ever get that exchange rate, I'm more than happy for you to take it. But you need a very large market, right? You need a lot of participants for these kind of models to make sense. And it's probably why we've arrived at a situation where there are so few accepted global currencies, right? Really just the big five. And so for Bancor, in trying to address this liquidity problem, this exchange problem with community currencies, we started to think about algorithmic ways of doing that. Do you really need an order book? Does there really need to be a person who is hosting a type of live auction, or can it be done algorithmically? And so what was invented is called the automatic market maker. And automatic market makers have the distinct advantage over traditional market makers in that they are not human, right? They are making markets between different currencies impassionately and without bias, right? They have no intrinsic profit motive for itself, right? It's just a computer program. And so it is completely transparent and predictable, and everyone who interfaces with it will know exactly what the outcome is. This is something that you will never get out of a Forex exchange, by the way. If you are trying to transmit, US dollars to an Australian bank account in Australian dollars, they will just give you like their best guess, right, of how many Australian dollars you're likely to receive. And within that margin, usually called the spread, is what the market maker is going to skim off the top. Automatic market makers don't necessarily do that, right? There is a fixed fee that you pay to do this, which is to incentivize the liquidity providers to make markets for you. But you agree to it ahead of time. You know exactly what it's going to be.
What's the fee for Bancor?
So it's set per pool, and so different assets have a different risk metric, and Bancor DAO is responsible for observing and maintaining that risk. And so, you know, some tokens that are, let's say, relatively illiquid, it is important to have a higher fee on that, and so it can go as high as, I think, at the moment, the highest fee we have on Bancor is 5%, which is ridiculously high, but that's for like very specialist tokens, and even then, anyone who is using things like, you know, Binance or Coinbase or something may be surprised that they may be paying a 20% spread and no one's ever even told them about it.
Is that set by the whitelist during the DAO?
It's set during, yeah, so let's get into like some of the mechanics here a little bit. So yeah, so Bancor DAO is a DEX, and in its first iteration, you would have to provide liquidity with two different tokens. One's the BNT token, and the other one is whatever other token you want to provide liquidity with. It could be Bitcoin, it could be Ethereum, Uni, Dogecoin, whatever it happens to be, so long as there's an ERC Ethereum compliant version of it. And so what the rule is that when one currency is traded for another one, first of all, the swap fee is extracted, and then the exchange is performed according to an algorithm. This usually goes right over the top of people's heads, right? And unless I can, you know, whiteboard this up and sort of go through it, and, you know, see me after class, and I'll set homework assignments, all that kind of stuff. It's very difficult for me to sort of explain through some of these concepts in exactly the way that they're done. So instead, let's have a look at a more simple example. Let's imagine that you are selling potatoes, right? And you've got a giant sack of potatoes, and you go up to the farmer's market, and you are deciding how to price your potatoes, and you've got no idea what the price of potatoes should be, right? Maybe the customers at the market are going to, you know, really want potatoes right now, or maybe they won't really want potatoes right now. So the idea is that as people buy potatoes, you're going to change the price of the potato. And as a potato merchant, you decide that the rule is that the first potato you're going to sell for 1 cent. The second potato you're going to sell for 2 cents. The third potato you're going to sell for 3 cents, and so on and so forth. And so really, whatever the nth potato is, that's the price that you're selling that potato for. This is something like how an automatic market maker behaves, except that it's also reversible, right? So if you are that potato merchant, whatever the price of the potato is now, you're also going to buy back potatoes from the market at that same price. So when people are buying potatoes from you, the price of potatoes goes up, and then when people are selling them back to you, the price of potatoes comes back down. And this is the system. Now, in early iterations of AMMs, it's not enough to just have a sack of potatoes, you also need a cash register, right, for all of those US dollars to go in, all the cents to be accumulated into. And so in order to first make the market, you don't know if the first transaction that you're going to get is for a potato or for someone to sell a potato back for US dollars. So you need to provide both assets, both the potatoes and the US dollars. On Bancor, in this case, it would be the potato and the BNT token. The BNT token is the universal numeraire for that system. And so the way to understand the Bancor network is that there are no US dollars, there is only the BNT token. So if you're selling potatoes, it's always 4 BNT tokens, and if you're buying BNT tokens, it's with potatoes. And that means that the next merchant in the system, who might be selling tomatoes using the same algorithm, right? First tomato for a cent, second tomato for a cent, so on and so forth. He's also using BNT tokens. And that means, because you know the price of a tomato in BNT, and you know the price of a potato in BNT, you can sell tomatoes directly for potatoes just by moving a BNT token from the tomato merchant to the potato merchant. And so you have this universal numeraire. Everything across the network is priced using the same asset, and therefore they all have a price realizable with each other, right? If BNT becomes the common denominator, then all assets in the network know their price versus every other asset in the network. So if you want to trade, for example, Australian dollars for Canadian dollars, or Canadian dollars to US dollars, or US dollars to Hong Kong dollars, because these are all plugged into the same token at the center, then they all know their value versus each other, and you get that same fair trade. So in version 1, you had to provide both, but then we were like, actually, that's not, super convenient. A lot of users, especially the Chainlink community, loves to hold just one token. and it's disgusting to them that they would be forced to sort of take exposure to another token in order to provide liquidity with it and keep the markets, functioning correctly. And so to deal with that, we made a change at the protocol level that said, okay, rather than users having to provide all of the liquidity, the protocol will always provide half the liquidity. So if you're providing the potatoes, the farmer's market itself will provide the BNT token, allowing that potato to be made liquid. And this entered into what is now called the single-sided staking paradigm, where the only DeFi protocol that makes liquid markets that has it. So instead of providing both like ETH and Link, does anyone use Uniswap or is a liquidity provider on Uniswap? I'm sure you're familiar with this idea that you have to provide both. On Bancor, you just provide one. And that means that you can feel free to have your portfolio comprised of whatever tokens you want in whatever ratio you want and provide liquidity with them at the same time. You don't have this prescription from the DEX that forces you to provide liquidity a certain way.
Okay, so you mentioned single-sided staking. Bancor has is it an insurance policy or an insurance?
Yeah.
And it helps with impermanent loss.
Correct.
Do you want to just explain that?
Who's heard of impermanent loss? Who can describe it? Yeah, no one. It's hard. I can describe it like this.
So when I first started investing into crypto, my goal was to increase my Ethereum stack, not the fiat value. And this sort of plays onto the same sort of aspect.
Yeah, absolutely it does. So there's more than one school of thought to think about this, and I'd say that Bancor is taking a much more generalized and let's say pioneering approach. Like we are developing new theory rather than relying on the financial paradigms of the old guard. But you can consider something like a liquidity provider positioned to be what's called a self-financing trading strategy. So let's come back to this example with the potatoes. Imagine that you are that farmer and eventually you're starting to sell potatoes for hundreds of dollars. And you're like pulling your hair out, why wasn't I selling potatoes for hundreds of dollars at the start? Like, why did I have to sell all of these potatoes at a discount before realizing the price that the market was actually happy to pay for it? And it's a good question. And that, you can see that as something like an opportunity cost, right? You have paid or you've lost a certain amount of value to discover the price of something. And some of our competitors in the space say that is the liquidity provider's gambit, right? That is the thing that they are essentially parting with in order to provide liquidity. And I just don't think that is a reasonable thing to decide that users should pay. So on Bancor, we say that whatever you provide, we ensure the full valuation at whatever time you finish providing liquidity. And so, for example, if you provide 1 ETH of liquidity to the Bancor Protocol and you make a 10% return based on fees, you will be eligible to withdraw 1.1 ETH in total valuation from the protocol as you leave. We don't force you to pay for the impermanent loss. This is something that Bancor insures. So we're not just a DEX, we're also an insurance company. And this method of insuring users, I think, is going to be, first, I think it's going to fare very well for us as regulation starts to get a little bit closer. I think that it's very easy to demonstrate that a lot of liquidity providers don't understand the financial downside of the risks that they're taking in other DeFi protocols. And at Bancor, we say, not only do you not need to know what it is, but we protect you from that happening to you. But it does mean that when you withdraw, you might get an insurance payout in BNT tokens. And so I can describe this very quickly. So if you have a car insurance policy, for example, and you completely total your car, the insurance that you get isn't for another car, right? No insurance provider does that. Instead, what they give you is the cash sufficient to buy another car. And so when you remove your stake from Bancor, if it's worth 1.1 ETH, but the best that the Bancor protocol can give you because of price action, because of available liquidity, is something like 0.9 ETH, then it will give you the difference, the 0.2, in equal value in BNT tokens, and that's your cash payout. And it's up to you what you do with that, right? The BNT token is superbly liquid, right? One of the most liquid assets anywhere in cryptocurrency.
And so if you want to exchange that for USDC or back for ETH or take it to Binance and swap it there, you're free to do any of that, but you still get the full dollar value of the liquidity that you were expecting to provide, which is something that no other DEX gives users.
Should we jump onto V3 and automation? So I know you've integrated Chainlink keepers.
Yeah.
How's that helped you?
Yeah. So how many Ethereum users do we have in the audience? Can you quick show of hands? Okay, cool. Can I get a quick show of hands if who thinks that the gas fees on Ethereum are prohibitively high at times? Right. Actually, more hands than the people that were using Ethereum. It's ridiculous, right? And it's kind of a cost of security, and the thing is that when gas fees get very low, spam on the network gets very high, and other things. But again, it's something that it is a user problem, and I think as a protocol that's building on Ethereum, it is necessary that we figure out ways to make the expense of interacting with the protocol as low as possible. And so one of the ways that we figured out to do that is basically to batch certain operations. So it's very common in smart contract design to use a user's action to piggyback another action. So for example, when someone performs a trade, you might use that to update a TWAP, price feed or something like that. And so what we figured out is that with a lot of the operations that we're using in version 3 that underpin both its security and also some of the financial aspects of it. So for example, we have introduced things like an auto-compounding reward system that means that both BNT stakers and TKN liquidity providers, if their own token is providing liquidity incentives, that they can be issued these tokens without ever having to pay gas, right? And without ever having to hit a manual claim. This also has tax relief benefits, by the way, because the way that the value appreciates on your pool position is more akin to capital gains than income, which is a huge problem for for these types of token incentives programs, at least until we get better tax legislation. But the way that we are able to provide that gasless process is through Chainlink. This batched process is a part of something that we call the harvester contract, and anyone can trigger it. Right? It's not the case that we make this exclusively available to Chainlink or anything like that. It's just there, and anyone anyone who participates by triggering it receives basically a very, very small fraction of the protocol's revenue. Right? It's not diminishingly small, but it's very, very small compared to the overall network performance. And we've integrated with the Chainlink system because one, their brand is basically fail-safe, right? Trustworthy. There are many keeper systems, some of them that we've integrated for other purposes, and I don't want to appear critical of them because they're close friends of Bancor, and I know many of them well, and their products do work very well, but nothing quite of the magnitude of Chainlink. And for something as important as this, you do want to be associated with a project that has never failed. And you don't get that anywhere else. Maybe anywhere else in the industry. And so what happens is that essentially the Chainlink keepers, when they trigger those contracts, the reward component is actively sold within our network for link, and then those links are distributed back to the contract from which the Chainlink keepers took their payment. So it still satisfies Chainlink's economics model, which is that all of the services provided by the Chainlink network have to be paid in Link. So we're able to do that, but the reason we're able to do that is because we're an exchange, and any value that we have can be exchanged for any value that you want. And so in this case, if you're providing Chainlink liquidity on Bancor, that is actually servicing the Chainlink network directly in this case.
Let's talk about the V3 a little bit more. Omni pools and infinity pools. What are they?
Yeah, so they're marketing terms. At the contract level, the Omni pool refers to a profound reorganization of the way that BNT holders provide liquidity. But it also refers to a new system that we were inspired by Balancer version 2 to construct, where instead of having discrete liquidity pools, so this is getting a bit down into the weeds. I guess I'm speaking to the members of the audience now who know a little bit about AMMs. But in the beginning, and we can come back to the farmers market example if this helps. But imagine that every single farmer there has got their own good, right? Potatoes and tomatoes and whatever else we spoke about. But instead of having their own collections of BNT tokens to transmit value between these goods, they all share the same cash register. So every time a BNT token is transmitted for a payment, it all goes into the same place, right? And we call this a centralized vault. And more than that, and this is where the farmers market idea sort of starts to become a little bit more difficult to interrogate, but also the potatoes and tomatoes and everything else is also stored in that vault, right? So instead of having thousands of cash registers all over the place, you now have one central cash register, and all transactions are processed on that central ledger, and so all value that goes in and out of the protocol has to go via that smart contract. There are advantages to this, because imagine someone who was wanting to sell a tomato for a potato. They might have to, go to one corner of the market, sell that good for BNT, and then walk to the other end of the market to sell it back for wherever good that they want. Much better to have sort of like a supermarket structure, where you just do all of that transactions in one place. Now, from a smart contract perspective, this translates to gas efficiency. That walking across, the market between different merchants, it actually has a literal gas cost. You have to send tokens to other contracts and perform more operations. Whereas if you're doing it all in the same place, all in the one contract, then the amount of storage that you're taking up on Ethereum, the amount of read-write transactions, and also the complexity of the computation is massively simplified. So that's the best way I can describe the Omnipool.
So would that help with yield? Would it decrease the yield or increase it?
Well, so in terms of yield, one of the reasons that it is likely to be yield positive, again, not financial advice, but one of the reasons it's likely to be yield positive is because to process trades on Bancor, the gas efficiency is heightened, right? So it used to be the case because of the complexity in version 2.1, it was obviously better for many trades to happen on an exchange that wasn't Bancor, because of the gas overheads of maintaining the system were very high. But in version 3, because that gas expense is significantly reduced, more of that trading demographic is likely to find the trade that they want on Bancor without having to say, oh, the gas is less desirable than what I wanted. So that should translate to a higher volume. And volume is where the fees come from, and that should make the user earnings go up.
Great. Anything else you want to add on Bancor B3?
Yeah. So one of the things that I'll add on with regards to Bancor version 3 is that we're also we also redesigned the system to be fully fungible and composable. So in version 2.1, it was very similar to traditional bank accounts, right? You have your own user position, it has its own data, and everything is treated completely uniquely, and this also had a huge gas overhead. Whereas on Bancor version 3, you now receive a completely ERC20 compliant pool token that represents your stake. And so if you want to send that to another wallet, if you want to use your position on Bancor to collateralize a loan on Maker or Aave, and we're setting up the security modules for these things with these teams, by the way, this is happening. But also, if you wanted to use those tokens in some other project's intrinsic use case, we can also support that. This is actually really interesting as we start to head into what I consider to be an existential threat to liquid markets and cryptocurrency with the onset of things like Link staking natively, right? So who is super excited, right, to stake their Link tokens natively on the Chainlink network, right? I know that people have thought about this. It's something that I hear about on crypto Twitter all the time. One of the problems.
So
go ahead.
it's called BNBNT?
Yeah, BNBNT is your, if you stake BNT, you get BNBNT. If you stake Link, you get BN Link. And one of the reasons I designed the system this way, and why the single-sidedness of it is so important, is because it is, its valuation is intrinsically connected to the valuation of the tokens that are underneath it. It's always going up relative to those tokens because of trade revenue, but if there's zero trading and no yield on it, then it's essentially got the same price as Link. And I spoke about this at Permissionless, by the way. I hope that at least I hope that some of you met me there. But some of these things will appear on YouTube, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. But I was on an expert panel for liquid staking derivatives. And one of the things that I said was that the market has got everything completely upside down. And it's actually led to a security crisis on Ethereum right now. So things like, for example, Lido, which is an Ethereum staking derivative, has now, I think, annexed 33% of all ETH. And so when it comes to centralization problems and who is really in control of the beacon chain, it is Lido. And that means that they might be able to make, I don't think that Lido is a malicious project, but as a chain that has always prided itself on being security maximalist and decentralization maximalist, these kinds of liquid staking options have sort of completely flown in the face of that. Undone, right? Almost 5 years of hard work. And so with Bancor, what we've said is, rather than stake the asset itself, right, for some intrinsic use case, and then try to force markets to make the derivative liquid, instead, why don't we stake the assets in liquid markets and use those wrappers to do things like chain security? And this is something I've spoken about at length. And usually the reaction that I get from from people that are very close to the architecture and are other industry experts is, that's actually really interesting, and maybe we should do that. And so I have a lot of conversations, for example, with the Link Pool project, because they have some liquidity issues that they are looking to solve. I've had these discussions with the Synthetics project, and they are interested, not committed to anything that we're proposing, but certainly entertaining those discussions. We're also having this discussion with Graph shortly, and the whole idea for this kind of stuff is that you don't really need the token itself to be the thing that's staked, just someone's claim to it, right? Having your, if you stake Link on Aave, for example, and get the A-Link token, it's just as devastating to you as a user to have that A token slashed as having the Link itself slashed. So the financial downside to misbehaving is exactly the same. It doesn't really matter what the wrapper is. And then there's this other kind of reaction that I get from non-industry experts, usually the crypto Twitter types, that I'm not sure what it is, if it's like a combination of sort of like rhetoric or just like a slightly skewed or misunderstanding of like where security comes from in staking mechanisms. But their immediate reaction is things like, the whole staking paradigm is to drive value to the token that I want staked, right? That somehow having 95% of the Link supply, staked on chain is, a bullish narrative for Link. And maybe it is, I'm not saying that it's not. But what it fails to recognize is that because it's competing for liquidity, because it could be harming liquid markets, that those same people that I spoke about at the beginning of this talk, they might see that as an opportunity to manipulate the Link markets. And we saw this with UST, right? Again, we have no shortage of examples as to why these people can't be trusted. Who here doesn't know what happened with the UST Terra Luna ecosystem, right? I'm sure you saw the meltdown, right? $38 billion essentially lost. In fact, new estimates are something more like $40 billion is lost. But I don't think a lot of people realize that when this person acted, right, when they decided that they were going to tank an entire blockchain, they waited for UST to be illiquid. That was the catalyst. What happened was Do Kwon started to remove UST from Curve because he was interested in establishing something called the Four Pool, right? And this was in some maniacal delusion that he was going to dethrone DAI or something as the ultimate stablecoin for blockchains. And so what they did was they waited for that liquidity to be removed from Curve and before it was established in Four Pool. And at that time, you can now throw off the price of UST, right, as it becomes illiquid. And it's generally easier to place a short and wreck an economy than it is to place a long and build one up. And these are the kinds of malicious actors that we need to be wary of. Like I said, this isn't some tinfoil hat wearing conspiracy theorist, garbage. This is happening. It has just happened. And they don't even make it secret that they're doing it. And so, if there's anything that you take away from my presentation, it's just to be wary that these things are there, and that things like the fungible composable system that we built into Bancor version 3 are designed to provide an alternative that stops that kind of stuff from happening. And I think that that's the thing I'm the most excited for, but I realize that it's kind of highbrow and not as sexy as something like a higher yield or a liquidity mining campaign, but I do think fundamentally it's the most important thing that we've done.
Thanks, Mark. Do we have time for a short demo?
I think we do. I need access to a computer. And so this is the version 3 thing. You can see that we've tried to make it as kind of clean as possible. One of the big design decisions that we made when we were designing the version 3 interface, and again, this is like a beta, right? It's always improving, is that we wanted to look and feel like stuff that people are already familiar with. A lot of DeFi apps sort of require specialist knowledge. They use terms that are unfamiliar or unhelpful, and sort of assume that the user already has enough information or enough knowledge in order to, in order to act on the kinds of things that they want. Let's actually put this on dark mode. I like this a lot better.
One of the first things I see is the DAI coin giving you 2.49% interest.
Yeah,
significantly better than any bank gives you.
Yeah, I see. Well, it's more than 100x better than any bank will give you. And as a decentralized app, it's still better than even most of the main market leaders, right? So this is, I think, something like Aave or Compound will give you something like 0.02% right now, which isn't their fault, right? This is just markets equilibrating. But these are the only 4 tokens that we have available right now, and these these interest rates are I think almost exclusively organic right now. The liquidity mining is basically ended. So what you're seeing here is the actual. I speculate. I need to check this, but these are actual proper yields from fee-paying customers, right? This isn't, or if it isn't right now, but this isn't sort of an inflationary tokenomics paradigm. That 1.75% you're getting on your link actually is in Chainlink tokens, which is significant. And more importantly, when you give us that link, we're not using it to short it, right? This isn't something like again, I have a lot of friends in the industry, so like Celsius and BlockFi and others. But what you have to realize is that most of those centralized services are lending protocols, right, or lending services. And they essentially loan those tokens out to market makers to short. And so the yield return that you get on some of those things, just be aware that it is playing directly into the hands of people that are manipulating the market for their own advantage. Whereas here, it's just decentralized liquidity, and people are buying and selling Link. But the link that you provide isn't being used to force the price of Link down, which is very helpful. But this is supposed to look like a bit like your online banking, maybe a little bit cleaner, hopefully. And eventually, this page is going to fill out with more than 150 tokens. We're a little bit delayed in getting that supported because we wanted to make sure that our scripts were running, at the highest level of confidence before we brought these out. So in about, I think, a week or 2 from now, the entire token catalog, which you can see on version 2, which includes things like, WBTC, USDT, WNXM, Engine, all of these tokens will be available on version 3 in the immediate future. So you can still actually use both of these, but we will be, providing incentives for people to migrate over to version 3 because this is designed to be the superior system eventually. And so if you want to participate, right, all you have to do is connect your wallet, and you can use any of the major ones. We support, things like MetaMask, Coinbase Wallet, everything that you want. And then it's just a matter of choosing how much you want to deposit. And you can see that, again, the interface is designed to be something that sounds very familiar. You can swap between a US dollar equivalent here. So if you've got some BNT in your wallet, for example, and you want to provide $100 worth of it, you can just put in 100 USD, and it will calculate how many BNT is necessary for that. And I need to check. We're constantly sort of in a state of flux here, but that price feed that determines that is currently a Chainlink price feed because we got sick of some of the other price feeds that we had being so unstable. So this is another way that we are integrating with Chainlink. Now, when you provide these, or again, I haven't connected my wallet here, and I'm not going to. You'll see that there is an option here to join the rewards program. This is that liquidity incentives that I was talking about. That adds, a slight benefit to doing it. And this is part of our equity distribution model as we continue to decentralize the BNT token. And these things are diminishing. So something like the like the Bitcoin halving cycle, where the block rewards started at some prohibitive amount back in 2008 and have been dying off ever since. BNT has that same diminishing profile, and so the idea is that the inflation rate should be dropping off over time to maintain a more robust and sensible monetary policy for the protocol. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to show. I don't want to go too far because there's some regulatory advice that I've received about demonstrating this to a live crowd, but I will let you know that we are collaborating with YouTube content creators who are setting up these kinds of tutorials online, and that is a much more convenient way for us to sort of disseminate this information.
Thank you, Mark. Let's ask some questions. Anyone in the audience have any questions?
I should point out, I think I've been asked to choose the most creative questions to receive stuff. Is that still the case? It's not true? I'll do it. I don't know if I've got anything to hand out. Do you guys have got some stuff? Okay. Yeah, so the most interesting questions win some Chainlink stuff. So put your hands up.
Might sound very silly, but just want to know, the Anchor Protocol or the other DEX where you stake your currencies and get rewards, how those rewards are generated and what you are doing with those state currencies?
You mean with the Anchor Protocol?
Anchor Protocol or the other same?
Yeah. So yeah, they're pretty similar. So the Anchor Protocol and I refer to this as just the liquidity mining paradigm, right? So since DeFi summer, and this is popularized by SushiSwap but not invented by them, the idea was that if a user is participating in the bootstrapping of a protocol, that they should receive some of the equity share of that protocol. And one of the ways to do that is inflation, right? So you can just create more tokens, distribute that to the protocol's users, and then as your market cap is growing, you're also distributing more and more of that share out. This is actually beneficial, right? This is one of the less controversial elements of inflation, is that it does stave off whale control, right? And it's very, very beneficial for that purpose, and one of the reasons that I am generally in support of it. But with what Anchor did is that eventually that stopped being the case, and some very large wallets were contributing huge amounts of capital, like billions of dollars of capital to the protocol, and basically swallowing up most of those inflationary rewards, and that was likely one of the reasons that they were able to obtain enough capital to melt down the blockchain. But what I want to point out there is that it wasn't really an APR. And a lot of DeFi does this very badly. And you're going to see me speak more and more about this over the coming year as I start to, let's say, re-educate the industry as to what these things actually mean. But let's put it this way. If you have, let's say you do some work and you make a pizza, take it out of the oven, and you're upset that you only have one pizza, right? If you cut the pizza in half, do you have two pizzas now? Because that's what DeFi calls a 100% APR, right? And if you cut that in half, is your APR now 400%, right? Just because you have more slices of pizza doesn't mean the overall amount of pizza is increasing. And this is one of the sort of snake oil type, marketing things that, that DeFi has leveraged. I would say to great success. It is good for certain things like bootstrapping a community and distributing a token, like I said, but it doesn't actually create value. It just dilutes value out over more and more people. So Anchor is guilty of this, as was Bancor, by the way. In version 2.1, we also had a liquidity mining campaign. The reason why ours didn't result in a meltdown is, one, because we're a lot more conscientious about how these things are implemented, and we observe the risks in a much closer way. So, for example, with Bancor, the distribution between what we call protocol-owned BNT, and this predates the protocol-owned liquidity paradigm by quite a ways, but the protocol owns a very, very large amount of the overall token supply, which means that when there's a bank run type event, right, like we saw in Anchor, it's actually impossible for the market to organically move the price very far from where it is. Because it's really when you start to get out of the range of like 50% selling, 60% selling, that kind of thing, where you end up in a death spiral. With BNT, it's literally impossible because the market doesn't own enough BNT to make that happen. Now, that won't always be true. If we allowed the liquidity mining to continue as it was in version 2.1, eventually the protocol-owned component would be sufficiently small and the user-owned component would be sufficiently large, they would end up back in that kind of fragile paradigm. But what's important to realize is that while we have been careful to not ever end up there, right? Anchor was born there and it never got out, right? And this is the same with many, many token projects. So yeah, with Bancor, we did have these inflationary emissions, and I am now trying to boot up a brand new narrative in DeFi that we really need to start doing smarter things and end with the gimmicks and start, building an actual, a respectable industry out of what we have. And so, yeah, we will be leaning away from inflation. But those numbers are not inflation. And look at this. On version 2.1, and you can verify this on our governance if you like, and I can show you where. Anchor had what, 20%, I think, was the rate that they're paying. If you have a look at our UST, it's 12.9% with no inflation. That's just trading revenue, right? There are a reason why market makers own yachts, right? And, build the Palm Islands. Market making is a very, very lucrative process. It's just that governments prohibit you from participating in it. But with Bancor, we're saying anyone can participate in it. And so for something like Anchor, I think that their approach was bad. I think ours is a lot better. But certainly, like some of these numbers, like, look at Itchy, it's currently at 35%. Oh, that's a weird token though, we've got a pretty high fee on that. But even things that aren't being traded all that much right now, like Engine, it's still a pretty stable 3% API. And I don't think that's anything to shock off, right? If you put money, like a US dollar, for example, in an American bank account, and they give you a 0.1 APR, that actually is still inflationary because of American economic policy, but also losing 15% of its value every year at present. So yeah, it's a very large economic question, and unfortunately I can't explore all of these concepts with you during this short answer. But I'm hanging around. If you want to have this conversation with me after the talk, I'll be more than willing to explore these a little bit more.
There was another question somewhere over here. Did anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned earlier the centralization risk with things like e-staking.
Yeah.
What's the plan when Bancor is offering e-staking?
Yeah.
Are you going to put that sort of proposal to the DAO and say, where should we be staking this ETH?
Yeah, super good question. So in order to avoid that, I would really rather that some of these other projects, and some of them have been, right? So 88 miles an hour, for example, is a French project that has it's essentially a tranched lending product, and offers kind of quasi-stable yields on stablecoins, and they have a voting token called the MPH token. And they've recently passed a policy to supplant MPH with BN MPH. So let's just explore the ramifications of this. It's not the case that when their users stake MPH on Bancor, that those MPH tokens are then put somewhere else to perform an activity. Instead, they receive a receipt, right? The BN MPH token. And that is used instead to perform whatever voting operations the MPH protocol requires of their users. And so that means that you're still not trusting Bancor with the security of your blockchain or with the proper functioning of your protocol. Because what we're claiming is that you don't actually need the token itself. A derivative of it is good enough. And if you take out the requirement for the token itself to be used and just use the wrapper, then it's every bit as decentralized as it always was. So at permissionless, the thing that I said was that it was a mistake for Beacon Chain and for the Ethereum developers to not anticipate that people who are staking their ETH would rather receive a wrapper for it, right, and be able to do things with that. Instead, they relied on third parties to do that for them, and that is where the centralization component came into it. But unlike Lido, unlike Rocket Pool, right, Bancor is not then taking the thing that you give and putting it in its intrinsic use case. What we're trying to develop a culture of is don't make Bancor do that. We can support that, right? And there will be projects that want us to do that for all kinds of reasons that are important to their protocol. But instead, just use the wrapper, use the BN token instead. And that way it's just the same as if those users contributed the token itself to your protocol, except that now it's liquid at the same time. So you don't run into these kinds of competitions between native staking and liquidity. The markets can remain healthy, and Bancor doesn't become the de facto whale of your protocol. So there are ways to implement it that these things never become an issue, but it's still an important question, and I assume that as these use cases continue to evolve, that we will need to consider some of these things more carefully, such that Bancor is never the de facto controller of another protocol. I won't let that happen.
Hi, Dr. Richardson, thank you for this excellent talk and very informative. So besides being a crypto and blockchain enthusiast, so I'm also doing my PhD in management. So what I'm also interested in is organizations, how organizations work. So as we are seeing more and more blockchain organizations, so can you review how organizations like Bancor works? For example, how you are paid. So you are paid in your Bancor crypto, or paid in Ether, or paid in USD. Things like that.
Yeah, I'm very happy to explore some of that. So for those who don't know, the Bancor was set up in 2017 with its ICO, which for a long time is a really dirty word. And it's taken a long time to sort of remove that stain, let's say, from Bancor's reputation. And it was by association, by the way, right? Bancor was always, a genuine, a genuine decentralized product setting up on Ethereum, but many that entered into that ICO phase weren't, right? This is the BitConnect sort of days. And so one of the things that we did, and again, is not, unfortunately isn't known enough, is that we actually stopped our raise early. So after introducing the concept of the AMM and our vision for a decentralized economy, I think Bancor raised something like $156 million in 2 hours. And we actually elected to stop the raise because it doesn't really make sense to keep raising money after a certain part. You don't see a lot of that today, by the way. I wish we would see more of it, people being more sensible with their funding rounds. But so we did that. We decided that at some point there is such thing as too much money. And we stopped the raise. And then it's like, okay, what do we even do with this money now? Right? We've got all of this ETH. So we set up a Swiss foundation. And so the Bancor Foundation, or B Protocol, is it is a regulated entity within Switzerland that has council members and sitting board members, and its responsibility is to continue to observe and support the very thing that the funding raise was for. Right, to support decentralized markets and to create a protocol that's self-sustaining, which is also why Bancor is partly unique because it's not a rent extractor. Right, so a lot of these DeFi processes and protocols are designed to sort of extract money from from the utilization of it and distribute it back to developers, for example. Bancor, being so well funded, never struggles with that. Right, the money that the foundation has is under a fiduciary management, and that's what's used to pay our salary. Now, everyone that works for Bancor is a contractor to the foundation, right? So there is no sort of Bancor Pty Ltd or something like that, right? We invoice the foundation for the work that we do according to whatever contract agreement we have with them, and the foundation insists that the people that have these contracts take some of that, take some of their remuneration package in BNT tokens. And this is the same way that companies offer something like an ESO or stock options, things like that, because it helps to better align the employees' financial interests with the performance of the product that they're building. So I was asked, would I like to receive my salary directly into my Australian bank account in Australian dollars? And that's something that you can do when you have a foundation, right? That's situated in Switzerland, right? It's not difficult for our bankers to perform that transaction, send it to any bank account anywhere in the world. But I am now actually living without a bank account. I am in this up to my ears now. All of the stuff that I do in my life, including paying my rent and electricity, I find a way to do it with cryptocurrency. And so I receive almost all of my remuneration in the ones that I chose were USDC and BNT. But if I wanted to, I could have chosen DAI or USDT or ETH or Link, whatever it happens to be. The foundation takes care of that. But yeah, I'm paid via that channel. Now that's not necessarily going to be feasible for all new projects. And what I will say is that if this is the sort of thing that you're investigating, I can connect you with the founder of the Request network, who's kind of figuring out a way to allow these kinds of disbursements to happen in cryptocurrency at the choice of the person who's on the receiving end. And also networks like AMP, right? Like there's another one I can't remember. But yeah, like it is a problem. It's recognizable and people are working on it. It's not a problem for Bancor, but we're kind of privileged, I think, in that regard.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for coming down to Chainlink London.
We got one more question if you want.
Yeah.
What do you think of the proactive market maker like the DO exchange? Is it a threat for you, especially on the impermanent loss on the V3?
Yeah, it's not a threat. So I also think that like even something like Uniswap V3, I think is like even though the impermanent loss consideration is catastrophic, it's not really trying to appeal to a mass market anyway, right? So things like Dodo, which are still mostly under the influence of private market makers, I think that's fine. I'm not saying necessarily that the private market making paradigm has to end. It's just a bad idea for it to be the only option, right? And so in a way, these kinds of decentralized models that we're building, because it is fixing the fact that there is no alternative, right? It kind of keeps the market makers honest. So Dodo, for those who don't know, and like DYDX and even KyberSwap, they have this kind of off-chain component where people are allowed to basically price quote. And so it operates very, very similar to a centralized order book, although it has some other utility to it as well. Dodo is, I think, it's very innovative. They're very clever. They were exploring the use of like Chainlink oracles at the same time that we launched our version 2 to try and solve some of these market making issues and ran into the same sort of problems that we had. And so I think that they are very clever. They do have a profoundly good understanding of the types of problems that they run into, but they don't share our ethos, right? They are the type of project that is looking to preserve the edge, right, that private market makers have rather than blunten it. And so, yeah, I'd say that even though we have very similar products, the actual goals at the end and the types of things that we're building out are opposing. And that's fine, right? I think it would be a bad, if Bancor became the only, liquidity solution in all of DeFi, that would probably also be problematic, right? It's about having a mixture, right? It's about having a good biodiversity, right, inside DeFi. So I'm not threatened by Dodo or by anyone else, right? I think that we have the only product like ours. I think that it is the most appropriate for the mass market. We're generating some of the most competitive returns anywhere in DeFi without asking users to take on any risk. I have nothing to be afraid of. But at the same time, private market makers aren't likely to use us, right? And for that, protocols like Dodo, protocols like DYDX are going to be a lot more attractive to that thin sliver of the available demographic that we're not pandering to. And I think that that's fine.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mark, for joining us. Thanks, Mark, for joining us at Chainlink Labs London meetup. Mark's hanging around, so if anyone wants to ask any questions, please have a look through. There are some food and drinks, I believe, so enjoy it and happy networking too.
If we're giving away the thing for the most interesting question, the gentleman in the beard and the white shirt, I think, had the most considered. And yeah. But thank you for your attention. I sincerely hope if any of you were stage shy and didn't want to say anything, that you'll come up and approach me as I walk around the room. But thank you so much for being here. It's been so great.
Thanks, everyone.